Good evening, Mr. Posen. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me all right?
Perfect. Thank you very much. We had just
Yes,
had a
I
long
can. Can you hear me?
discussion. Yeah, we can see you all. So we just had a long discussion about the post-election scenario. And so we'd like to ask you a few concluding remarks about what's next in terms of politics and economy in the United States.
Thank you very much. I'm really grateful to get to do this. My greetings to Minister Tremonti, to Secretary Dasu, and all my friends and colleagues at Aspen Institute Italia. It's been my pleasure to work with them a lot the last few years. I'm greeting you from Washington, where things are not as excited and happy as they were, say, 4 years ago when we had the historic election of Obama. But there is an enormous sigh of relief. Just as Marta Dasu was saying about Romney talking about very tough measures on China, he was also talking about some very abrupt measures on fiscal policy in terms of tax increases, which I know you were discussing, very abrupt changes in some regulatory issues, and these were going to be highly disruptive, and we've escaped that. So where is the U.S. economics, and to some degree I can talk a little about politics from here. I think the first thing to say is, even though and I think most people would believe that the Obama economic team and plan are going to be better than what the Romney team was, none of us are that excited about the next couple of years. By comparison to Euro area, UK, Japan, US will be doing okay. We expect that the US is going to grow reasonably strongly, 2% plus this coming year. There is some chance it might do far better than that. The biggest place the U.S. has to catch up is in housing. They built a huge number of houses, as everybody knew, back in the early 2000s, but they built them in Nevada and California and places where people have frankly left. And meanwhile, since mid-2006, we've been building around 600,000 houses a year. Just to keep pace with population, we need to build in the U.S. around 850,000 houses. So we've got several years built up. And if there's going to be a positive surprise in the U.S. economy, it's probably going to come from the housing market. Everybody talks about the fiscal cliff. We have a new colleague at the Institute I just hired, David Stockton, who used to be the chief economist of the Federal Reserve. And he has some numbers that I agree with that say, were we to go over the fiscal cliff, it would be like suddenly taking us from where we are now to where Spain is. I don't mean in terms of unemployment, but I mean in terms of tax increases and government spending cuts of 5+% of GDP in a year. And I am very confident that's not going to happen. I can go into more detail if people are interested about all the little gamesmanship. Are there going to be tax increases? Are you going to call them tax increases? Who will they be on? If they don't officially call them tax increases, maybe what they'll do is call them revenue enhancements or closing off of loopholes. Many of you are familiar with such discussions and tricks in the Italian tax situation. But I am very confident we're not going to go over the cliff. And if we don't go over the cliff, then things should move forward. That won't solve every fiscal problem in the U.S. We're still going to have a debt level that's approaching 90% plus of GDP, which is a serious matter. But there are two pieces to the U.S. debt problem. One is this gap between we keep spending a little more than we tax, even in good times, and the other is our healthcare costs. The first one, the spending a little more than we tax, again, by European standards, by what many countries, including Italy and others, are doing right now in Europe, is not that hard a gap to close. It's probably about 2.5% of GDP a year. So were we to say to introduce a value-added tax, a consumption tax, we could close it overnight. I'm not saying that will happen in the next 3 to 6 months. It probably won't, but it could well happen in the next year. So a big part of the budget problem will go away. The difficult part of the budget problem is, as you probably know, is our healthcare system is enormously expensive, more expensive than any other rich countries, and the prices just keep going up, 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 up. The Obama healthcare initiative that was passed was enormously important, and it did a little bit to get healthcare costs under control. It certainly expanded coverage greatly without increasing costs too much, which was to its credit. But there is still an issue there of healthcare costs that have to be dealt with going forward, and we have about 10 years, maybe a little longer, to deal with that. And I frankly do not expect major progress on that, even in the second term of Obama administration. Picking up on some things you were saying about China when I listened to the last part of the discussion, where is the international economic emphasis going to go from this new Obama administration? I think there is something of a pivot to Asia, and the situation in the Euro area, of course, encourages that. Everyone is aware, particularly the people in the State Department, but also in the Treasury, that our closest allies remain Europe culturally, in terms of values, in terms of economic systems, as well as being the rich countries. And so it is very nice to hear the European Commission say, well, maybe we should go ahead with a real free trade agreement, US-EU, something along the Trans-Pacific Partnership lines. Or maybe since the EU has a very good deal now with Korea and the US has a very good free trade agreement with Korea, maybe we can give each other what we gave the Koreans. I think people underestimate how likely it is we could do this. I think there would be a lot less fear in the Congress of a trade deal with Europe than there would be with China or other countries with low wages. So it is possible that there will be some real progress on this, and that's why I commend the European Union, the Commission rather, for coming forward with this proposal. But ultimately, if you have a Europe that is stagnating, that is wrestling with its own problems, that has people in human terms, be it in Italy, Greece, Spain, very unhappy, if not opposed to the current course of economic policy, it's very hard for the US to actively engage with Europe. And that may sound selfish, but unfortunately that's the reality. And so the emphasis on Pacific developments, I think, and possibly even Latin American developments, which have been somewhat neglected in the first Obama term, I think will continue. And just to emphasize something I think Marta Dasu just said, the trip to Burma, it's not really about Burma, it's not really about encircling China. This is the ASEAN group is having their big annual meeting, and the president wants to be there because it's a way of showing the commitment to Asia. There is obviously some signaling going on vis-a-vis the disputes that China is in with, say, Japan over the islands and other islands with the Philippines, with Taiwan. But I think everybody is very aware that at this time of leadership transition in China, it would be extremely ill-advised to do anything overt or threatening. And I think everyone is going to bend over backwards to be careful. So the dialogue with China will go on, perhaps even joint military exercises will go on. I don't think there's going to be a very obvious showing of the US fleet there. Anyway, I'm getting a little out of my area of expertise. There are people in your group who can talk more about this. But in terms of economic integration, I think that the emphasis going forward will continue to be with China. There will continue to be some friction over the exchange rate, but until the last couple months, it looked like China was making some major changes that were helpful to the world economy as well as helpful to China. And so if the leadership transition doesn't throw that off track, we may actually be in for a good period of US-China relations, which would be largely good for the global economy with some adjustment. You will hear a lot if you pay attention to the American press, and some of this no doubt has been reported in the European and the Italian press, this idea that the Republicans were the white male party and the Democrats were the non-white, non-male party. This is somewhat exaggerated. There was an enormous number in the millions of non-white females who voted for the Republican candidate. Remember, the election was still very close in popular vote terms. But, as is familiar to many people in places such as Italy, in Japan as well, there is an extreme regional divide, urban versus rural. There's an extreme age divide that largely splits along similar lines, young and urban versus rural and older. And the one ethnic part that clearly reinforces this is the rise of what we call Hispanics, meaning people of Latin American background in the US, sure. Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, El Salvadoran Americans, and so on. That group is now up to roughly 13% of the voters in the last election, which makes them about the same number of African Americans who vote. And that group demographically, because they're younger and because they're poorer, as well as for cultural reasons, tends to have much higher birth rates than the white Protestants, the rural types in the US.
Absolutely.
So over time, there is some serious talk about the Democrats having a sustainable majority because the world is becoming in the US more urban, more young, less purely white. And so even though, thank God, our main issues of the country are not racial, if President Obama does make progress on immigration reform, which is really about how we treat the people coming from Latin America, yes. and how we treat the Mexican Americans and others, or rather the Mexican citizens who are not US citizens who are here, the guest workers. If he makes major reform on that, he could lock in the Hispanic vote for the Democrats for years to come.
Thank you so very much for your perspective, and thank you for being with us tonight. Ringraziamo a questo punto, direi che questa è idealmente...
Yay, thank you, Adam.
Please.
Thank you very much, Adam. And
it's Marta Dassù.
Yeah, looking forward to a discussion, another discussion in Rome on this transatlantic marketplace or something like that. De Gucht, the commissioner yesterday, made the proposal you were mentioning, and Italy in particular, together with Germany, we are very keen to go on in this direction. So I hope that in your new position as chairman of the Peterson Institute, you will be interested in discussing with us and with the Aspen Institute this topic too. Thank you, Adam.
Grazie, dunque grazie anche a tutti voi per questo lungo attraversamento del nuovo scenario americano, e quindi direi appuntamento fra 4 anni è il minimo, quella è una delle poche cose certe, quindi appuntamento fra 4 anni, d'accordo. Buonasera a tutti.